Hello. On behalf of the Shawnee County K-State Research and Extension Office, welcome. Today's presentation is the fourth of our Fall into Gardening series. We are so pleased to have our Shawnee County Master Gardener, Ed Dillingham, joining us today with his presentation, Xeriscape Gardening. Whoops. Before I turn it over to Ed, I'd like to ask that all participants please turn off their cameras and microphones for the duration of the presentation. If you should have any questions, please type them over in the chat box. And once the presentation is over, we can all turn on our mics and cameras and have some Q&A. We will be recording today's webinar, which you'll be able to find later this week on YouTube, our website. And also, Kathy Bartles will send out a copy of to all our registered participants along with a short survey. I ask that you please do fill out our 3-minute survey. It helps us continue to provide quality programming. So without further ado, it's wonderful to introduce Master Gardener Ed Dillingham. Ed?
Okay, thank you, Leslie. My discussion today is on drought-tolerant plants, better known as xeriscape gardening or xeriscape landscaping. That concept was started in Denver in the 1970s as a preemptive measure in case of water shortage. Since that time, the concept has spread across the United States and in various other countries of the world as a means to grow plants while saving water. So, growing in Kansas. Kansas is one of the most challenging places to garden in the United States. We deal with the extremes: heat, cold, moisture, dryness, and wind. And we'll discuss each of those next. Heat, and especially temperature change, is very prevalent in Kansas. This month, we went from the mid-90s to the high 40s within 24 hours. And then we stayed in the 50s and 60s for highs for the next few days. My vegetable garden shut down during that time, and it's taken it about a week before it has started to produce again. So plants are affected by not only the heat, but the changes in the temperature. Some of the factors that affect the heat in the garden are pavement. The sun shines on the pavement heats up, and it stays hot well into the evening and night. Others is the mulch that you use. If you use black mulch or rubber mulch, those will heat up and they will get so hot that they will actually scorch the plant leaves if the plant leaves are laying on the mulch. And we normally don't think about rocks as a mulch problem. A lot of people don't use rocks, but those rocks have a high heat capacity, and they will absorb the summer heat, and they will then feed that back into the plants for the evening and the rest of the night. And of course, we have the full sun exposure. Most of the plants that we would recommend for the xeriscape gardens, they want full sun. Some of them will be okay in partial shade, but the vast majority of them want full sun. The cold. And once again, we have the same situation. It's not just the cold, it's also the sudden change in temperature. In wintertime, it's not unusual to have periods of below freezing temperatures, and then day heats up to 60 or 70 degrees within a 24-hour period. After a few days later, it drops back down to freezing. These are the things that the plants don't like, is this sudden temperature change. You can have plants that grow in freezing and below freezing weather, but it's these sudden changes that really cause the problem with the plants. We see this in the spring when we have, say, a warm week, and then we get a sudden cold spell, and the flowers have started to bloom, especially the fruit trees have started to bloom, and then they all freeze. So that's an example of where it's not just the cold, it's the fluctuation in the weather. Sunken areas or low areas are also impacted by the cold, not near as much as what I just described, but we see that around in the fall when you're getting that first frost. Low areas, cold air is heavier than warm air, so those cold areas, they may get frosted in them, whereas an area maybe only 10, 12 feet higher may not get frosted just because it is a little bit higher and the air is a little bit warmer. The other thing is proximity to homes or other structures. These all absorb the heat from the sun and they feed it back to the nearby plants, gardens, and stuff like that. So plants that cannot survive on the north side of your house may survive on the south side. Water. Watering is one of the biggest issues in the garden, and overwatering probably kills more plants than anything else, including your house plants, your vegetable garden, your Xeriscape garden. It's easy to overwater if you're not careful. And it's especially true of perennial plants because most of them do not need a whole lot of water. You got to remember, you can train your plants to do a lot of things, but you can't train them to swim. Just like us, the plants need water, and they need air. Without air, we get root rot, and with root rot, the plants generally die. Basically, the roots suffocate. The number 2 reason that plants die is underwatering. Underwatering puts stress on the plants. When plants are stressed, then diseases and pests are attracted to that stressed plant. So, if the lack of water doesn't kill them, then the pests and diseases will likely do the job. There's a sizable window open between those two, overwatering and underwatering, and that's where we need to be in. When in doubt, underwater. Most plants prefer underwatering compared to overwatering. Extreme droughts in the summer, and about 3 years ago, we had extreme droughts across the state, extreme drought in our area. And most people don't realize that our winter months are is the season that we get the least amount of rain. So that's why a lot of times you get advised that if the soil is not frozen, to water your plants in the wintertime, because they need a little bit of moisture just to make it through the winter. The other thing is improper watering techniques. Look at the picture on the slide. On the very left, looks like we're watering the pavement. In the middle, we're watering the foliage. Watering the foliage keeps it wet, which then you get diseases, fungus in there. The fungus kills the plant. You pull the plant out, and for that area, your watering is done. The last picture shows a man just going to go in and water a little bit. Just water the top of, excuse me, the top of the soil, and that's good enough. That is one of the things that perennial plants do not want, and that we warn people about, is you need to water deeply and infrequently. And using plants for other zones, especially wetter zones, or that require significant amounts of water. You want your xeriscape plants that are in our zone. Our zone is 6A. Many of the plants that you should be interested in are in zones that they grow in zones 3 or 4, all the way up to 8 or 9. Zone 3 is the Canadian border. Zone 9 is far south Texas to the Mexican border. So we're sitting right in the middle. It gives you a lot of choices of plants that will grow in our area. Drought. And I love this picture. You look at the title, drought. Look at the picture. It's pouring down rain. In our own Xeriscape Garden at the Shawnee County Extension Office, we don't exactly follow the guidelines that are shown on this slide. The first year of establishment, we water deeply, but we water in the beginning at least once a week. I should say only once a week. And then later on, we may switch that to once every 2 weeks in the first year of establishment. In the second year, we may very well go to every other week at the beginning of the year and go to once a month by the end of the year. The third year, depending upon how the plant is doing, we try to wean it off of any extra watering. Now, of course, all of our watering is done based upon the rainfall that we received the previous week. And at that point, we do not water the entire Xeriscape garden at all unless we are in extreme droughts, in which case then we ask for permission, and if it's okay, then we go ahead and water the entire garden, and we water it deeply when we do so. I think in 2017, we actually watered the garden either once or twice during that extreme drought. Wind. Wind is always a factor in Kansas. We go from dead still to 50 to 70 mile an hour winds, depending upon the storm front that's coming through. It depletes plant moisture by drying out the soil, which means that you should have some kind of a mulch on it, and by just drying out the leaves, the leaf transpiration. Also, wind can damage plants through breakage. And this is one of the subjects that I see an awful lot when I look at the plant care. And there's quite a few solutions. One of the solutions is you plant in areas that have a building that blocks the wind. You can use constructed windbreaks, such as a privacy fence, or grow hedges using bushes or tall ornamental grasses. And there are cultural things you can do. You can cut plants back in late spring or early summer to reduce their heights. Or you can take the easy way out and just select plants bred specifically to stay short. So starting a drought-tolerant garden. If you remember back in high school, you were writing a story. There was the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And that's kind of the same thing as starting a drought-tolerant garden. The first thing to figure out is, why do you want to start a xeriscape garden? You may want to be outdoors, you may like gardening and plants, but you don't like those sky-high water bills during the summertime. Next, look at the wind. When is the best time to start a garden? Like all gardens, the best time to start a xeriscape garden was last year. You need time for the rough plan and site preparation, including a soil test. Make sure that you're in the ballpark for growing drought-tolerant plants. And you also need to remove and kill all weeds and grasses, especially those hard-to-kill plants like bindweed and Bermuda grass. And you're probably going to need to use chemicals to do so. Roundup is a great chemical. I'll tell you a little secret about Roundup is, when you use your normal city water, that water usually has a little higher pH than 7. 7 is a neutral pH. And when you get above 7, you get into an alkali condition. And alkalinity reduces the effectiveness of Roundup, but there is a fairly easy way to handle that, and that is to add a little ammonium sulfate, about 1/4 of a cup per gallon, and the ammonia helps the plants grow, which you didn't really want to help the weeds grow, but you do want them to take up the Roundup. And the sulfate actually reduces the pH of the water and makes the Roundup much more effective. You need to add the ammonium sulfate before you add the Roundup, because the reaction is very, very quick to deactivate portions of the Roundup. The next thing you need to do is you need your site selection. Partial shade is preferred, but most of your plants, most of your xeriscape plants, perennials, want sun. And they prefer sun, that full sun, which is defined as at least 6 hours of direct sunlight. Most of them can tolerate partial shade. If you get too much shade, then they're going to grow tall and lanky, and then they're going to lodge or fall over. And that's something, when I'm looking at the plant care requirements, that we get warned about over and over. Watch for too much shade, because you're going to grow tall, lanky plants. Wind block preferred, yes, and I talked about that. If you can, if you can't, then go ahead and do one of the things I talked about concerning taking care of the wind damage from blowing plants over. Soil test, add the exact nutrients your soil needs for healthy plants. There's no such thing as the exact nutrients because your plants are going to differ somewhat. But one of the important things also in the plant care guides is most of your xeriscape and perennial plants do not want and do not need rich soil, high fertility soil, because that's what makes them grow long and lanky. And of course, you do need some nutrients, so you grow good roots that support the plants. You want deep roots, so they use much less water and less stress on the plants. I'm going to skip this one momentarily and come back to it. Design of your garden. Think of how you will water your garden. Is the water nearby? Because you're going to need water to start your garden for the first year for sure, possibly the second year, probably not the third year. Can you access your garden easily? And that, think about if you've got a steep slope, are you going to have stairs? Are you going to have to bring stairs down or bring tools downstairs, your garden hose downstairs, something like that. Is your garden visible from your home so you can check plants regularly? Out of sight means out of mind. Your garden does need to be checked regularly, especially those first couple of years. Gardener resources. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to pick up the one we skipped. Here are some gardener resources. Prairie Star is a handout that K-State has provided for plants that grow well in Kansas. Prairie Star is for annuals. Prairie Bloom is the same thing except for perennials. You need to pick the right plants for your exposure. Like I said earlier, most of them like sun, some of them like partial shade, very, very few like full shade. You also want to check the bloom times because you'd like to have plants that are blooming, some plants that are blooming all season long. And of course, plant varieties. And that can be difficult. Some of these plants have 300 or 400 varieties, but only certain ones grow well in Kansas. And we'll talk more about Prairie Star and Prairie Bloom next. And focus on planting perennials. If you want to reduce your workload, you'll plant perennials. They're there year after year after year. We've got some perennials in our Xeriscape Garden that have been there over 20 years, and they're still looking good. This is the Prairie Star handout for annual flowers, and I know you can't read the fine print down there. I have a copy of it, and so I will at least talk a little bit about it from my copy. The title on the individual subtitles on the plants for flower display. You've got the flower name, you've got the cultivar, and the color. You've got planting location, sun or shade or partial shade. You've got the height that the plants will get, and these are full-grown plants, and you've got the width for the full-grown plants. As I looked through this brochure, the first part of it is plants for flower display. And I looked page after page after page, and with the exception of a few of them, they all require full sun. That's your annual flowers. If you want plants for foliage display, there you start getting into sun or shade. And those are plants like the coleus. And there aren't a whole lot of them that don't like sun also. I've looked at, there's 7 pages of full sun, and there's about 4 more pages of sun or shade. So by far, most of your perennials are going to like the sun. If you're going to get partial shade, it's good to have the partial shade on the west side. The reason for the west side is in Kansas, we get a lot of dew early in the morning, and we like to get that dew evaporated off of the plants as quickly as we can, because the dew helps fungus grow in the plants. So the quicker we get that moisture off those plants, the better for the plants, and that is the sun coming up in the east. The shade on the west, if you can get some plants in the shade, they actually lets the flowers bloom longer. And so, and basically you think about it, the hot sun in the west, it is going to be really tough on those flowers. Furry bloom, you've got your perennial flowers, and same thing. I've got the copy that I can read that you can't, and the first part is perennials for the sun. Common name, the genus, you'd have to be a genius to pronounce some of these. The cultivar, the color, the height, the width, and week of first bloom. That's kind of important from the viewpoint that a lot of these plants will grow from zone 3 at the Canadian border to zone 9 at the Mexican border, and they're not going to all bloom at the same time. So the week of the first bloom, that's nice to know. Looking through this, there is page after page of perennials for sun. When you get to perennials for shade, in fact, I've got 7 pages of the listing for perennials that like the sun. Perennials that like the shade, there are 4 pages and 3 different varieties. The plantain lily, the shrub rose, I guess 2 of them, take up about roughly 70% of the pages. So you don't have very many varieties that will actually grow in the shade in the perennials. We have a Xeriscape brochure that's on our Shawnee County website, and it tells you about how to grow, how to start a Xeriscape demonstration, It's a front back page. It gives you a short version of what you need to get a Xeriscape garden started. And we put this one in because I'm a vegetable garden grower. And there's nothing wrong with putting a few vegetables in your Xeriscape garden, especially in the early spring, because most of your perennials are not really going to be very showy until you start getting into the late May, early June time frame. So it's okay to put a few annuals in your perennial garden. Might as well make them vegetables. Beets make a pretty leaf, and they're good to eat. Carrots are look good in a little garden. If you're going to do that, though, remember they are annuals, and you're going to need to water them. So you want them where you can get the water to them, and you don't want to go overboard. This is on a website, www.kansasroots.org. And this is a downloadable document that combines the two documents that I talked about before, the Prairie Bloom and the Prairie Star. And it just makes it easy to find what you want. And also, something I failed to mention on these is the reason for the Prairie Star and the Prairie Bloom, the reason plants are selected is they are tested by K-State to see if they are going to make it in Kansas under our weather. The main station is on Olathe. There's another station in Wichita, and there's another station in Hayes. So that kind of takes care of all of our different areas in Kansas and our different climates that we're going to have in Kansas. Only the best are listed in these two documents. So it's a good document to have, and it's probably one that you want to carry with you when you go to the store and you start looking for plants, because the stores are not going to have Prairie Star listed on them or Prairie Bloom. So you're going to need to look at it, and selecting the right variety is paramount to being successful on growing plants. You can do all you want with the soil, build the soil up really great, but if you choose the wrong plants, you're going to be disappointed. Another site that's a great site is on Kansas State University, the Horticulture and Natural Resources site. And I'm looking at it. We get a lot of great information from it under the Horticulture Information Center. And I'm just reading a little bit of what they do feature and recommended plants. And they've got a listing for drought tolerant plants for Northwest Kansas, and drought and water wise plants for South Central Kansas. So those are probably the Wichita and the Hayes findings. If they'll grow in either one of those places or both of those places, they're going to grow in Kansas. Looking at some of the others, the plant pest problems, if you got plant pest problem, that's got a detailed listing of many of the pests that we encounter. And It tells you what it is, why, and how to get rid of it. And then there's the one pest of the week. I'm show up on that list, I think, every once in a while, especially if my horticulture agent has anything to say about it. So, okay. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story here. When I was working, I worked a little while in California, on the high desert in California. And on the high desert, you can grow 2 plants without irrigation. One is cactus and the other is tumbleweeds. So I was there for about 6 years, and then I came back to Kansas. And after I retired, then I decided to sign up for the Master Gardeners. Went through the course, and at the end of the course, they ask, which committee do you want to work on? And they asked me about Xeriscape. But I didn't recognize the term Xeriscape, and I thought they said Xeroscape. Well, I immediately said, yeah, that's the committee I want to be on, because I've had 6 years of training out on the California high desert seeing Xeriscape. This is what the Xeriscape garden looks like at the Shawnee County Extension Office. In the front, you can see the yucca plant with its candle in bloom. Behind it is a hot red poker, and behind that you see our redbud tree. So we do have a tree. In fact, we have 2 trees in our Xeriscape garden. Look at the green around the redbud tree. That is lily tuft, really looking nice, and it points to you there is a plant that can grow in shade, and it can tolerate the tree roots. It looks real good right now. Here is a second picture of the Xeriscape garden. The hollyhocks look great, are showing off the colors. You can see the red, you can see the white, and that third one is a pink. Behind them, you can see another yucca plant with its candle showing colors. And in the forefront, you see coreopus with the yellow, and they're really doing good. Here is the picture from the west side, and you see the catmint, Walker's Low, the blue in the front, and you see a peony, the old-fashioned white peony in the background, and it looks like it needed to be deadheaded before this picture was taken. Interestingly, right on the top left-hand side, you see a little bit of a tree. The wind about a year ago caught that tree and ripped it out, except for one root, ripped it out of the ground. We tried to set it back up, and a year later, the tree had not rooted any more than it had before. And so we decided that it's not worth keeping that tree constantly braced up. And so we took it out. But that's one example. That tree was on the southwest side of the building, and it completely, the wind just one time completely took it out. That completes this presentation, and I'll turn it back to Leslie.
Oh, thank you so much, Ed. You know, when we were practicing your presentation, I think that was the longest I had ever gone without hearing you tell a joke. So I'm so glad that you sprinkled some in for the actual presentation.
Thank you.
No, that was wonderful. Do we have any questions? We didn't have any questions in the chat box, but we had Ariel gave us all a lot of wonderful links to the publications that you were talking about and the websites you were talking about, and just a few comments. But if we all want to turn on our cameras and turn on our microphones, we have some time to have a little Q&A.
I have a really important question for Ed. What is your favorite plant in the Xeriscape Garden?
That's a hard one to say. I have to think about that because it changes as they bloom. St. John's wort was really a nice plant when it was blooming. It bloomed wonderfully, and I loved it. Burning bush in the late fall is really a nice plant, and I kind of like the peonies, and the reason I like the peonies is I consider them a crabby plant. They basically say, leave me alone, don't bother me, don't do anything. So I kind of like them.
Awesome.
Now I got a question for you, Ariel. Am I going to show up on the pest of the week?
Well, Kevin said, I said that you were not a pest, but then Kevin chimed in and said he was surprised you weren't on the list every week. No, when
Thank you, Kevin.
Only 1 week?
when you teach a program, you get removed from that list permanently.
All right. So I can be as much of a pest as I want to.
Hey, Ed, this is Susan Quinn, and I didn't hear too much about fragrance. Is there, I love fragrance in the garden. Is there any fragrant plants that you like, or roses at all, or is roses just a big no-no?
We have one rose in our garden, and it has not done very well. It may be that it's in too much shade. It's been here a long time. It may need to be refreshed. Not too many of your perennials are going to be fragrant. We actually do have a sumac that is called fragrant sumac. But some of them have some fragrance, but you're going to have to look for that in the listing. One of the things I failed to mention is if you know the variety and you know the common name, one of our favorite websites, certainly my favorite website, is the Missouri Botanical Garden website. If you know the common name, a lot of times you can just type it in there and it will bring up all the varieties that they have. And they have many, many varieties. And those varieties will describe the plants pretty well. And that's the first site I go to. And yeah, Ariel just put it up on the screen, how to find it. I go to Google and type in Missouri Botanical Garden, and it takes me right there. It's one of the favorite.
Yeah, I don't know why, but I planted a Josie lilac long time back in my south garden that is right next to the house. so it gets a ton of heat. But I don't water it at all because I don't like watering next to the foundation of the house because my basement. Well, that thing has just gone to town, but I did amend it. It's a raised bed, a little bit of a raised bed because of the retaining wall that I had to put because it's such a slope. But boy, that Josie is, and he's real fragrant too.
Yeah, there are fragrant ones. It sounds like what you've got is something that I see very, very common in plant care. In fact, very few plants like a lot of water. Probably I've looked at about 100 plants on the plant care. I'm going through our Xeriscape Garden and trying to get some better plant care information from them. And invariably it says that it wants a well-drained soil. I would say that 95% of the plants that I looked at said well-drained soil. They can take clay. Most of them can take a clay. They can take a poor soil. They can't take water. I had one plant that said, lead me to the water. And it had, in its name was swamp. It was a swamp grass. So it fits.
Something that strikes me about our Xeriscape Garden is the number of regular plants that are in there, like peonies and coreopsis and catmint. I mean, we don't have just cactus or just succulents. There's a broad range of great plants in our garden.
Yes, and that's part of what we're trying to do is we're wanting to put common plants that people would use, and we want to test them to see how well do they do in this garden. It also gives people an opportunity to come and look at the plants before they decide to put them in their garden. So that's one of the reasons that we actually have the garden, and we plant a wide variety. We are also taking a look at the plants that didn't make it and trying to see why they didn't make it. Okay, quit laughing, Kevin. I can see you. So that's one of our goals too, is if they don't survive, why didn't they survive? Did we do something wrong? Or are they just not a good plant for where we're planting them?
Ed, I noticed that you didn't talk too much about grasses. Are there grasses that you particularly like for the Xeriscape Garden?
I like a lot of the grasses. I think they really set off the garden. They're great for background, and we have about 5 or 6 different grasses. And the plant breeders are doing such a good job of getting the color in the grasses. They're not just green grasses.
Mm-hmm.
They are really getting color. And I say the same thing about the yucca plants that we do grow. They're getting such varieties from yucca plants that they really look good. They're not just the cactus anymore.
Great, thanks.
It'll ask my question. This is Tammy. I'll ask my question in just a few seconds. But first of all, I want to thank you for doing this today. And I was really surprised when you said you weren't a genius. That's such a shock to Kay Phillips and I, because you just took us under your wing back in January as newbies and showed us in the greenhouse when Lynn wasn't there. So thank you. Thank you for that. And so then the question regarding the tree that was taken out, remind me what the type of tree was, and was there hope that sometimes with wind damage then, roots will take hold again with And what was that particular type of tree again?
It was a crab tree.
The crab tree, okay.
Talk about
Yes.
that if you wanted to, Ed. Unless
Pardon?
you wanted, I could talk about that if you wanted me to.
Yeah, go ahead.
It was a Sargent, what was the variety? Sargent red crabapple or something like that?
Yes.
It was beautiful, really pink, fragrant flowers in the spring. You almost couldn't see the leaves because there were so many flowers the last 2 years. And I actually think that's because the tree was dying. Trees tend to flower a lot when they're dying as a last ditch effort to reproduce. But Ed, I think, was the one that found it. We just walked out and this tree was totally uprooted. No pun intended. It was just like totally gone. So we had one of our extension master gardeners is an arborist. And then we had another arborist from the John C. Pear Horticulture Center come down, and they actually air spaded it. It was very cool. So this tool blows all of the soil off of the tree roots so we can very clearly see what's there. And what we discovered is there was one large lateral root and nothing, virtually nothing else. This fly is like just attacking my whole face. There was nothing else supporting the tree. And so Tim, who was our other arborist that came down from the John C. Pear Center, he said that it looked like there had been termite damage, but termites don't feed on healthy roots. So he saw that there were some other things going on with the roots. He wasn't sure exactly what had killed them off. There were some galls and things that were indicative that the roots had suffered damage. Then the termites came in and fed on those decaying roots, but those decaying roots were offering the tree support. So they weren't feeding the tree, but they were physically supporting it. When the termites started to feed on it, it was no longer being physically supported and it tipped over. We put rooting hormone on it, put it back, held it in place, and then it blew over a couple more times. So that was it for the crabapple, but it was a beautiful tree. And it was wasn't it like 25 years old, Ed? I want to say it was planted in the early 90s. So
Yes, it was.
yeah, so I think we got our money's worth out of the tree.
Thank you.
How
Ed,
interesting.
is there a
What is
list? Excuse me, go ahead.
I just wanted to know what the air spade kind of looked like.
I have a video of it somewhere, but essentially it was just like an air compressor that had a hose with a little nozzle on the end. So it wasn't a super crazy, it was probably a very expensive piece of machinery, but it looked, like nothing special. But it was cool because once you blew off all the dirt, you could really see the roots. And if you do it carefully, you can see even the really small roots.
Ed, I was going to ask, is there someplace, is there a list someplace of what currently is planted in the Xeriscape Garden in case somebody wants to review that or refer to it?
Yes, we have a list. We actually have a map, and on that map, we've got locational data, or locational what the plant, what we call the plant. And we're also we're working on a plant list in which we give the common name, we give the botanical name. Between those two, you can find it on the website, read about it. And we're looking at the various sizes and plants likes, plants what it don't like. In other words, pretty much a plant care document, and I'm working on that right now. That is not online. Our maps are on our website. We got to do a little bit of updating because we've taken plants out that didn't do well, and we've cut plants back that did too well. So that information is around.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions for Ed?
Okay, well, thank you all for joining me. I hope that you learned something and can use it. And there's another one coming up. Leslie, you going to talk about that?
Yes, and thank you so very much. Your presentation was so wonderful, and I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us. I really hope you learned something new today and feel encouraged to add some xeriscape plants in your garden and help protect our water as the precious resource that it is. So please join us next week at the same time for Shawnee County Master Gardener Lynn Weaver's presentation on plant propagation. She said it's one of her very favorite subjects, so I think we're in for a treat. So we'll see you then. Take care.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Ed. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Ed.
Bye-bye.
Yep, you're all welcome.